Good afternoon. How are you? It's the penultimate one before we start, wrapping the conference. I do hope that so far you have had good insights. And just before I start, just to let you know that I'm delighted, to be back in the Baltics and very pleased to be talking today about one thing that I found over the years. After 25 years of teaching, consulting with organizations and individuals, after a course, I typically get two things. One that is great news. People say, Javier, we found these insights and these tools fantastic. And that makes me happy. But then they add a but. But my negotiation world is different. The way I negotiate is somehow different to some of the things that you explained. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to cover some of the strategies that you can consider in terms of negotiating. And the assumption I'm going to be making is that there's no one way of negotiating, that there are a number of ways. And I'm going to address this idea of agility, this idea of being able to shift negotiation strategies from one to another. So the 3 points that I will be making are, first, there's no one way of negotiating. It depends on circumstances. Second, I'm going to offer you a framework that has 4 key elements and 4 strategies to negotiate effectively. And third, I'm going to try to briefly talk about the implications for us as negotiators, but also for the organizations that we work for and for the contexts in which we work. So the first one, most of the time, and most negotiations can be seen as a continuum from win, lose, to win-win, and I'm sure that this terminology is absolutely familiar to all of you. If you come to this, one thing is, how do you do it? There's very little explanation as to how do you shift, from one continuum to another. Then you can look at a number of other ways of negotiating, and you have some of the keywords that you will typically find in negotiation literature and in negotiation work: persuasive, competitive, distributive, problem-solving, integrative. But none of these actually tells you when to use one versus the other. Correct? So I want you to think, what would be the things that would make you choose and select one negotiation strategy versus another? I'm going to propose that there are 5 areas and 5 dimensions that you may want to consider. The first one, the need for trust. Is trust needed in order to open and disclose information that will help the process of value creation? Second, what is the degree of dependency, which explains the power balance between different parties, typically 2 parties? The third one, what is the importance of the relationship? Is this relationship one that will have the ability to help us create more value? Think about when negotiating with other parties, how is the longevity? In other words, do you have time to adapt your behavior? And will the way you negotiate be able to evolve over time? And the last one is the complexity. What are the different elements and the variables that are being negotiated? If you think about these 5 dimensions, the chances are that you will be in a much stronger position to choose the most effective approach. These are typically variables that will give you some insights as to how to establish the way you will go in with the negotiation. So I'm going to offer this compass. The idea is that if you start from the top right, you think about negotiation as bargaining. In other words, a highly distributive element where the focal point is actually in capturing value. Trading, as the name suggests, is about exchanging different elements. Then collaborating, which is about creating some commonality, and the final one, partnering, that actually brings together the highest level across those 5 variables. So we look into these 4. What I want you to look at is that these 4 different approaches are distinct. And they are distinct, first, in the intended purpose. They all have a different aim at heart that you need to consider. These different strategies will have a different orientation. The strategies I'm going to describe are typically characterized by different levels of openness and different behaviors. These 4 different strategies can also manifest in the way you make demands and in the way you offer concessions, and they require different levels of flexibility. Now, if you think about an example, I was talking to someone and I flew Air Baltic. If you think about a Baltic, they will have a number of different types of negotiations. For instance, they could have bargaining negotiations with a supplier of office supplies. It's a commodity product. It does not add value to the organization. It's not critical to the business. So what would be the approach that you would take if you were in procurement dealing with an office supplies company? Well, possibly asserting power and maximizing your own gains. In other words, having the highest quality material in terms of these consumables and at the best possible price. So if you look at some of these type of bargainings, we all have these in our daily lives. When you buy a second-hand car, when you buy a house, for instance, a very important decision, you're not going to see the person that you're buying the house from ever again, unless you are in a professional real estate. So in these kinds of negotiations, the advice and the suggestion is that you adopt a strong bargaining approach. And that bargaining approach focuses, the orientation is exclusively on getting the best that you possibly can. The type of behavior that you would expect in this context is assertive, is quite confrontational and controlling. And there is merit in so doing, because you are most likely to claim value if you adopt these behaviors. This type of negotiation will require no information exchange, so you limit to the maximum how much you tell the other party, because everything you say could be used to the other party's advantage. Bargaining is fundamentally about high initial demands, anchoring the process strong to your advantage, and then offering minimal concessions, and those concessions are offered in smaller decrements. Therefore, you take a very low flexibility approach, a very rigid approach to make sure that you get, as I mentioned, the best and the best outcome for yourself. Now, one of the sports analogies that I would use is boxing. So if you think about this kind of negotiation, it can be equated or can be associated with the sport of boxing, where there is a fight between two players. The next approach that I call trading fundamentally has a purpose, is offering calculated concessions for favorable agreements. Some of these agreements should be favorable for your party and eventually could also be for the other. If you look at the orientation is self primarily. So you are also considering and understanding what the other party's interests are. You're also trying to understand where the party's constraints could be, but fundamentally your interest is in getting the best deal for yourself. The behavior that you would typically expose in this context is very pragmatic. It is driven by proposals. It is heavily calculated, and you try to offer concessions in a very simple way. You demand things from the other party that are high value to you and low cost to them, and vice versa. You prepare yourself to give to the other party things that are low cost to you and high value to them. The type of degree of openness you want to exchange, you want this trading to be satisfactory, and therefore you may need to very tactically and very moderate disclose some data. Just enough data to get the deal that you and the other party are willing to agree on. Trading is about quid pro quo. It's about fundamentally exchanging so you can have an equilibrium, and fundamentally an equilibrium that favors your position, and therefore you should consider a limited amount of flexibility. So far, what we have described are very often some of those negotiation strategies that you would adopt. As I mentioned before, there is relatively low value to be gained. The relationship is not a fundamental one. There's not a long relationship. The complexity of the deal is reduced, and the need for trust tends to be low. This trading is sometimes what I call tennis. So you are playing tennis backwards and forwards with the other party. The third strategy is about collaborating. What you try to do in this negotiation approach is to understand and address both the manifested and those underlying interests and constraints. Therefore, collaborating is fundamentally about trying to understand where the parties come from before you start driving an agreement that may be favorable for the other party and also for yourself. Typically, you will focus on both. You will try to express what are your priorities, and you will also try to get from the party some of their interests. The way you would typically behave is cooperative. You try to creatively solve problems that are important to you. And you have a high level of disclosure. You need to work with the other party so they understand where those sources of value are. What are the things that can be discussed and negotiated? These demands, the ones that you make, and the concessions that you ask from the other party focus on options rather than just on specific and constraining demands. And therefore, you need to be flexible. You need to have the ability to show ample level of flexibility. So going back to the example of AirBaltic, if you think about in the previous one, when you talk about trading, you could argue that that is the right approach when you're buying a significant item for your company, one that drives operating costs, such as fuel. So Jet A is a commodity that you can buy from a number of suppliers, and the cost of that item is significant. Now think about an airline these days. It's not just about flight operations. It's fundamental about the end-to-end passenger experience. So if you were buying from an IT company, the technology that supports your app or the technology that allows you to do all the booking online, these would probably be featured by a highly collaborative style. Once again, in this type of situations, you have a lot of value to be created and a lot of value to be distributed. These relationships typically have a high degree of complexity, and you need some degree of trust to be able to create that value I describe. And the final one is about, so for instance, in terms of analogies, I would use the analogy of rowing. So you're working together, you are going in the same direction with the other parties that you're negotiating with. And the final one is about partnering. So the focus is maximizing joint outcomes, and the word joint is crucial here, and also the relationship and the development of those relationships through creative solutions. How would you describe this approach? Well, the first one is the orientation is self and other in such a way that creates a high level of engagement. The other party becomes almost embedded. When you walk to a partnering type of negotiation, you cannot distinguish who is the supplier and who is the customer. You cannot see where individuals are coming from because they are working together to maximize and really to create and push forward the boundaries of value creation. The behaviors that they typically display are collaborative, transparent, fully aligned. There is a clear purpose as to what is going to be achieved jointly, and individuals behave consistent to some of these parameters. Partnering requires a high degree of disclosure. It requires a high level of information exchange so that both parties can actually work with the best data and the best evidence to create novel solutions. Typically, what you find in partnering is that the demands that you make are oriented to a joint problem rather than traditional concession making. And the flexibility that you adopt is very often full flexibility to accommodate different constraints that the parties may have. Going back to the example, if you were AirBaltic negotiating with Airbus, for instance, the purchase and the maintenance of the Airbus 220 that they fly, this would be the right approach. This is going to be a long-time relationship. Typically, you will be operating these aircrafts for 15 to 20 years, and you definitely want the best capabilities from the supplier, in this case for the aircraft manufacturer, to ensure that those planes are serviceable and airworthy almost all the time. So if you think about an analogy for partnering is when you're mount climbing. You need to work together with your climbers. You need to be watching for each other so everybody's safe in order to culminate and in order to reach the climax. This is what partnering is all about. And I have a question here. Can you please raise your hand if you like mountains, if you like trekking? Yes? Okay, I don't see many hands. Yes, anybody likes mountains? Now, keep your hand up if you also like rowing. Okay, rowing, so, yes? Okay, keep your hands up if you have practiced mountain or trekking, rowing, and tennis. And now, put up your hand if you have practiced rowing, mountain, or trekking, tennis, and boxing. Okay? All together. All the four sports together. 1, 2, There are 2 hands within 600 people. I have a question, and this is, I was alluding to this question by using this analogy. Can someone be equally top class sports person in these 4 sports? Can you be recognized and world class in rowing and at the same time in boxing? Can you be world class in boxing and at the same time in tennis? The question I want to bring to the discussion is, can you be world-class negotiator when it comes to bargaining, trading, collaborating, and partnering? Hands up, how many of you think that you can master the capabilities required, as I described, to be able to operate equally effectively across those 4 different types of negotiations? Again, the question is, how many of you think that someone can develop the skills to be equally effective across those 4 types of negotiations? Okay, I can see very few, almost 2, 3, 4, 5. This is our challenge. I believe that in your organizations, you negotiate different things that require different approaches. For instance, we all negotiate with our line manager. We negotiate the expectations of how we will deliver our job. We negotiate the standards, the timeliness of what we do. And that's a negotiation that is fundamentally characterized by power imbalance. I assume that your boss has more power than you have. Is a negotiation situation where you don't have asymmetry of information because your boss knows what you do and has access to data in the same way that you have. Therefore, the approach that you take in that situation is very different from the approach you would take with an external supplier or indeed with a customer. Therefore, the question is, how do we make sure that we develop the ability to negotiate equally effectively in those 4 aspects? So, first, for individuals, let's think about the key here is to be able to shift behavior. The idea to become better in all these types of negotiations, assuming that those are negotiations that we are often involved in, is what I call behavioral change. How do we explain, and what are the things that you can consider to understand behavioral change? There's a very well-established theory called the theory of planned behavior, which basically states that how individuals behave depend first on their attitudes. Second, it depends on norms. And third, it depends on expectations. The first, the attitude is about your belief that a particular behavior will lead to an outcome. The norms, the subjective norms, are your understanding of what others expect from you. And the final one is perceived behavioral control, is about your ability or your conception as to whether you are able to do something. Therefore, negotiators will change their behavior if they think that they will achieve better outcomes, if that's what their peers or their relative others expect from them, and if they believe that by changing behavior, or that the actual fact of changing behavior is doable. Therefore, the main implication for individuals is to develop the opportunity and the practice to engage behavioral change. My view is that we should strive to become a 360 negotiators, individuals who are able to negotiate equally effectively across the 4 elements of the compass. My experience, some people have very strong preferences. How many of you have come across a tool called the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Management Inventory? Yes, some of you, right? As you know, some people have a particular tendency to either avoid or compromise, or or avoid or accommodate. In other words, these are individuals who do not feel comfortable when confronting in this positional bargaining or trading. Well, these individuals will have, and this is the implication for HR and L&D. We learned this morning about HR and the importance of negotiation. The most impactful negotiation programs will be those that address precisely not just the behavior, but also those underpinning beliefs that individuals hold. When I ask people, having done exercises, why didn't you go for more? Sometimes people say, well, because I was content with this, and this was a fair deal. The concept of fairness and equality is a very subjective one. If you want to become a full negotiator, a 360 negotiator, you will have to develop the ability and the belief, not just the behavior, to achieve that. Therefore, the implication for L&D professionals is that negotiation programs need to address different dimensions. I very often think about negotiation as the science and the art of managing simultaneously behavior, cognition, and emotion. Cognition is what you think, your analysis. AI is here to help us with that. The second one is behavior, what you say and what you choose not to say at the negotiation table, or if you are negotiating virtually, at the negotiation screen. And the third one is how you regulate your emotions. I haven't yet, after 26 years of practice, found a way to leave your emotions behind or outside the negotiation room. What's the implication for teams? If you think about fundamentally, the notions and the theories that I'm bringing forward are fundamentally enhanced by feedback. Therefore, I would encourage everyone before and after any major negotiation to engage in proper and structured feedback, so you can actually learn from what happened and refine your approach in the next one. And the final one, companies, we have heard today about how some companies approach, like Google, negotiations. Companies need to develop an ethos, or call it a strategy. They need to develop the ability to get people into this mindset of negotiating better across this compass is good. So I hope that you can see that different negotiation approaches will require different skills, different mindsets, and different approaches, and indeed that this serves you to become equally professional and equally effective, whether you are negotiating a one-off transaction in a bargaining or trading situation, or indeed a larger, more complex deal across multiple stakeholders. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias.